Jeremy, who's trying to take credit?
Well, this is universal credit. And originally, this was the brainchild of Ian Duncan Smith. It's called brainchild because it's like a brain, but smaller and not as well developed. And that's what Ian Duncan Smith has got. And when he was Secretary of State for Workhouses and Penury, he devised this idea because he was worried about the poverty trap. And George Osborne, who was then Chancellor, said, well, I know traps are cruel, but how else do I keep the poor off my land? And then Cameron said, well, dogs would be more humane because it would be quicker. But the townies are terribly sentimental about the poor, you see, but that's because they've never seen the carnage that the poor leave behind them in a chicken cottage. And people don't understand the poor are pets. They're just rats with scratch cards. People used to be poor in 6 ways, but they've rolled it into one benefit that you can't live on, because they said it should never be in a circumstance where you're better off not going to work. So they've made it impossible for people to heat their homes. So at least they'll always be warmer if they go into work. It never occurred to them that they could actually make wages higher to make sure that you're always better off working. They just thought, well, we'll just make people so poor that they have no choice. They did pilot it, which always suggests it's not a very good idea. When the Attlee government brought in the NHS and the welfare state, they thought, this is so good, let's just do it to the whole country at once. They didn't think, well, we'll try it in Oldham, and if no one dies, we'll go ahead. But they've decided that right before Christmas, they'll roll the plan out further, despite the fact that you don't get any money for 6 weeks. I suppose the idea is that during that 6 weeks, you learn your lesson, you think about what you've done, and you realise it's high time you inherited some money from somebody. And the one thing they've said they'll do is they'll make the phone line free, so that you can listen to Vivaldi's Four Seasons for hours on end without paying.
That's right, because it was what? It was 55 pence a minute from some mobiles, wasn't it, to get help? What have Labour been up to in response to this?
Oh, I don't have a clue. No. They voted it down, right? They passed a motion against it, and they opposed the phone thing particularly. They sort of pressured the government into scrapping the 55p phone bill. Because, I mean, it was only from mobiles, and you could tell it's this sort of typical Tory thing where it hadn't occurred to them there might be people who only have mobiles. Like, it's completely free if you send your butler. Why don't you just...
They said it was a symbolic victory for Labour. Had quite a lot of symbolic victories of late, haven't they? It'd be great if they could have an actual victory. That would be really good.
It's a shame, universal credit, because it's essentially a good idea. You know, it's the idea that benefits are far too complicated, and you want to make a system so simple that an idiot can understand it. Unfortunately, what happened there was they announced this as the plan, and Ian Duncan Smith came along and said, I'm an idiot, and they said, great. You sort it out then, and he sort of has, and it doesn't quite seem to be working so well.
Have you been following this, Desiree?
Well, I've been basically learning about this a little bit. I mean, basically, it's, it's simplifying by, cramming it into, one system, which, I had to be explained to me just now, because I was like, universal credit, that sounds like what Theresa May wants to take for all of Labour's ideas. But the thing that I read that seemed particularly messed up is that essentially, it does take the 6 weeks for them to pay you in arrears, but they are willing to give you a loan of up to 50% of what they owe you in advance that you then owe them.
It's a bit like if you went to AA and you said, well, I'm doing a bottle of vodka a day, and they just said, have you thought about cider? What the Tories don't seem to understand is that this is all about money, because they sort of say, well, the important thing about poverty is getting people into work. And you say, yeah, but a lot of poor people are in work. Well, yes, exactly, because poor people need to be in work. Yeah, a lot of poor people are in work. Yes, it's not actually work that makes the difference to poverty. I mean, none of us here do any work at all, and yet we're all doing fine. It's nothing to do with whether you've not got a job. It's how much money you've got. But the Tories just seem completely unable to grasp that vital connection between poverty and not having any money.
It's a form of sorcery. It really is. This is the ongoing row over the introduction of universal credit. With this week's Commons vote, Labour scored a big symbolic victory, which is a massive coup for all these symbolic benefit claimants out there, and indeed paves the way for Corbyn to become the country's first entirely symbolic Prime Minister. Universal credit works by combining 6 regular payments into one easy-to-understand administrative holocaust. The Conservatives denied that the 6-week wait for universal credit showed they were out of touch, saying that claimants could do what everyone else does when money gets tight and simply sell a painting. Labour also managed to get the government to abolish charges of up to 55 pence a minute for the Universal Credit Helpline, which was a bit much considering the first 10 minutes are just Secretary of State for Work and Pensions David Gauke whispering promises that he will chat you all the way to climax. 2 points. 2 points to Jeremy. And at the end of round 1, the scores are Jeremy and Desiree have 4, and so too do Hugo and Suzi.